Leah sat in the dimly lit hospital corridor, her fingers trembling as she clutched the medical bill. The numbers blurred before her eyes, but the amount was impossible to ignore. Too much, far beyond what she could ever afford. Her mother was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, fighting for her life. Her younger brother, still in school, had no idea how dire their situation was. Their family had once been stable, comfortable even, but ever since her father's business failure and sudden passing, everything had fallen apart. She had tried everything, working multiple jobs, borrowing money, even considering selling their small apartment. But nothing was enough. That was when she received the unexpected offer. Leah reread the business card in her hand, her heart pounding. Adrian Knight, CEO of Knight Enterprises. The name was intimidating. Everyone in the city knew him, a ruthless businessman, cold and emotionless, a man who controlled power like it was his birthright. And now, he had offered her a deal she couldn't refuse. Marry him. No love, no romance. Just a business arrangement. In exchange, he would pay off all her family's debts, cover her mother's medical expenses, and ensure her brother's future was secure. A contract marriage. She had laughed bitterly when his assistant first presented the idea. Marriage was supposed to be sacred, a union of love and trust. But what did love matter when her mother was dying? When her family was on the verge of being thrown out onto the streets? She had no other choice. Later that evening, Leah found herself sitting across from Adrian Knight in his luxurious penthouse. Everything about him screamed power and control. The way he sat, calm, composed, exuding an air of dominance, made her feel suffocated. "You understand the terms?" His deep, smooth voice cut through the silence. Leah swallowed hard, nodding. No love, no expectations. Just a contract marriage for 1 year. He studied her, his gaze unreadable. "You'll be my wife in name only. In public, we will appear as a couple. But in private, we'll remain strangers." Strangers? Leah clenched her fists under the table. Was this what her life had come to? Selling herself for money. "And after 1 year?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. "We divorce." His response was immediate. "You get your money, and we go our separate ways." Simple.
Clean.
No complications. Except, Leah had a feeling nothing was ever simple when it came to Adrian Knight. 2 days later, Leah found herself standing in front of a mirror, wearing an exquisite white wedding gown. It was a dream for many women, to wear a dress like this, to walk down the aisle toward the man they loved. But her wedding was nothing more than a transaction. There were no guests, no family, no friends. Just a lawyer, Adrian, and a cold exchange of vows. Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger, an expensive, dazzling diamond. But to her, it felt heavy, suffocating. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant said. Leah tensed, her heart racing. Was he really going to? Adrian simply leaned in, pressing a chaste, emotionless kiss against her cheek, before pulling away as if even touching her was a mere obligation. Cold, detached, just as he had promised. And just like that, Leah became Mrs. Adrian Knight. That night, after the wedding, Adrian escorted her to his penthouse, a place that now belonged to both of them, at least on paper. "You'll stay in the guest bedroom," he informed her without looking at her. "We will rarely cross paths. Do whatever you want as long as you follow the rules." Rules. Of course, there were rules. She wanted to argue, wanted to throw the contract in his face and scream that marriage, no matter how fake, shouldn't be like this. But she couldn't. Instead, she swallowed her pride and nodded. Understood. Adrian gave her one last glance before disappearing into his study. The door shut behind him, leaving Leah standing alone in a house that didn't feel like home, in a marriage that felt more like a prison. And yet, she reminded herself, this was what she had chosen.
For her family.
For survival. But what she didn't know was that behind his cold mask, Adrian was already watching her with hidden emotions, ones he refused to acknowledge. Leah woke up to the unfamiliar luxury of silk sheets and a massive bed that didn't feel like her own. For a moment, She forgot where she was, but reality crashed down like a wave.
She was married now.
Not out of love, not out of choice, but out of necessity. The guest bedroom, her new home, was far too grand for her taste. Minimalist but elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. A place that belonged to the powerful Adrian Knight. She let out a breath and got up, glancing at the bedside clock. 6:30 a.m. Would Adrian expect her to act like a proper wife? Would they have breakfast together? Shaking her head, she dismissed the thought. Of course not. He had made it clear last night. This marriage was for show, and in private, they were nothing more than two strangers living under the same roof. But when she stepped out of the room, she found the dining area already set with breakfast. Freshly brewed coffee, toast, eggs, and even a glass of orange juice. She hesitated. Did Adrian prepare this? Her question was answered when she spotted a middle-aged woman moving around the kitchen. You must be Mrs. Knight, the woman said warmly. I'm Helen, the housekeeper. Mr. Knight asked me to prepare breakfast for you. Leah blinked. He did. Helen nodded, placing another plate on the table. He left early for a meeting, but he made sure you'd be taken care of. Her chest tightened at the thought. So, he wasn't completely heartless. Thank you, Helen, Leah murmured before taking a seat. As she quietly ate, she tried to understand her husband. Why had he chosen her? He was one of the most powerful men in the country. He could have married anyone, yet he had offered a deal to a struggling nobody like her. What was he hiding? Later that day, Leah decided to explore the penthouse. She wasn't used to living in such extravagance, and it made her uncomfortable. It felt like she was trespassing in someone else's life. While walking past Adrian's study, she heard voices inside. I don't need her interfering with my life, Nathan. Adrian's voice was calm but firm. Keep her out of my business. Leah's breath caught in her throat. I understand, Nathan, his assistant replied. But the press will expect you two to be seen together at the gala next week. A pause. Fine, Adrian finally said. She'll attend. But make sure she knows her place. Leah's fingers curled into fists. Knows her place? She had no illusions about this marriage, but hearing him speak about her like she was an inconvenience still stung. She took a step back, planning to leave quietly, but the door suddenly swung open. Adrian stood there, his expression unreadable. Dressed in a sharp black suit, he looked every bit the untouchable CEO the world feared. You're awake, he said flatly. Leah lifted her chin.
Yes.
I was just looking around. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he stepped past her, adjusting his cufflinks. Since you heard the conversation, I assume you understand, he said coolly. Understand what? She asked, crossing her arms. Adrian glanced at her. This marriage is for convenience. Nothing more. Leah felt something inside her tighten, but she forced herself to nod. I know.
Good.
He turned away. Then don't expect anything from me. The words were meant to push her away, but Leah caught something in his voice, a trace of hesitation, of distance he was forcing upon himself. She wanted to ask why, but knew it wasn't her place. This was the man she had married. Cold.
Detached.
A stranger who had bought her freedom at the cost of her heart. And so, she said nothing as he walked away. What she didn't see was Adrian's grip tightening around his cufflinks, his only way of stopping himself from reaching out to her. The week passed in a blur, and before Leah could fully adjust to her new life, the Knight Enterprises Gala was upon her. Leah stood in front of the massive wardrobe in her room, staring at the collection of expensive designer dresses. It felt strange. Just days ago, she had been struggling to pay hospital bills, and now she was expected to dress in luxury and stand beside a man who barely acknowledged her existence. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Helen, the housekeeper, entered with a gentle smile. Mr. Knight sent this for you. She held up a dark emerald evening gown, the fabric shimmering under the lights. The dress was elegant, modest yet breathtakingly beautiful. Leah hesitated. He picked this. Helen nodded. He didn't say much, but he was specific about the color. Leah traced her fingers over the smooth fabric, a strange warmth settling in her chest. Why did he care what she wore? She quickly shook off the thought. This wasn't real. It was all for show. The grand hall of the five-star hotel was filled with the city's elite, business moguls, celebrities, and reporters eager to catch a glimpse of Adrian Knight and his new wife. Leah felt her heartbeat quicken as Adrian extended his arm toward her. "We need to make an entrance," he murmured. His touch was warm, his grip firm, but controlled. Just for show, she reminded herself. As they walked into the ballroom, all eyes turned toward them. Whispers filled the air. "She's beautiful. But she's just an ordinary girl. Why her? Do you think their marriage is real?" Leah kept her expression neutral, just as Adrian had warned her. A perfect wife in public. A stranger in private. Adrian led her through the crowd effortlessly, his usual cold demeanor intact. Yet, every now and then, his grip on her waist would tighten, as if shielding her from the eyes of the world. When they stopped to greet some guests, Leah found herself standing next to Madeline Hartwell, an elegant socialite known for her past relationship with Adrian. Madeline's eyes flickered with amusement. "Adrian, darling, I didn't think you were the type to settle down." Adrian's jaw clenched slightly. "Things change, Madeline." Madeline's gaze shifted to Leah, her smile condescending. "And you, my dear, how does it feel to be married to the city's most unattainable man?" Leah knew she was being tested. She could either appear weak and uncertain or play her role flawlessly. So she smiled sweetly and slipped her arm through Adrian's, pressing closer. "It's wonderful," she said smoothly. "After all, not everyone gets to see the side of him that I do." Adrian stiffened beside her, and for the first time that night, he turned to look directly at her, his gaze dark, unreadable. Madeline raised a brow, but didn't push further. "How lovely," she murmured before walking away. As soon as she left, Leah felt Adrian lean in slightly. "You handled that well." Leah smirked. "What? Did you expect me to embarrass you?" Adrian said nothing, but something in his expression softened for just a second before he pulled away completely. The rest of the night passed smoothly, but by the time they returned home, Leah was exhausted. She kicked off her heels and sighed. That was tiring. Adrian loosened his tie, his expression unreadable as he studied her. "You didn't have to hold on to me like that." Leah raised an eyebrow. "It was necessary. Or would you rather let them think this marriage is fake?" Something flickered in his gaze. "Isn't it?" Her breath hitched, but she forced a smirk. "I thought we were supposed to be convincing." Adrian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his towering frame making her heart pound. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Just don't forget the rules, Leah." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, wondering if she was the only one struggling to follow them. The days after the gala were strangely quiet. Adrian barely spoke to Leah, keeping himself buried in work. It was as if the moment they stepped out of the public eye, he reverted to being the cold, distant man she had married. Leah told herself she didn't care. This was a contract, nothing more. But then came the night of the storm. Thunder rumbled through the sky as heavy rain lashed against the penthouse windows. Leah sat curled up on the couch, a book in her hands, though she wasn't really reading. Adrian hadn't come home yet. Not that it was any of her business. Just as she was about to go to bed, the front door opened. Adrian walked in, soaked from head to toe. His dark suit clung to him, his usually perfect hair messily damp. Leah frowned. "You're drenched. Why didn't you use an umbrella?" Adrian ignored her and loosened his tie, heading straight toward the bar. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, taking a slow sip. Something was wrong. Leah hesitated before walking over. "Adrian, are you okay?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "Why do you care?" She crossed her arms. "Because you're my husband, at least on paper. And right now, you look like you've had a terrible day." He didn't reply, just swirled the drink in his glass. Leah sighed, then left the room, only to return moments later with a towel. She placed it on the counter beside him. "You'll catch a cold." Adrian stilled for a moment, as if taken aback. Then, without a word, He picked up the towel and dried his hair. For the first time, his walls cracked just a little. Later that night, Leah lay in bed, unable to sleep. She kept thinking about the look in Adrian's eyes, the loneliness hidden beneath his cold exterior. She didn't know why, but she wanted to understand him. Just as she was about to close her eyes, the bedroom door creaked open. She sat up in surprise as Adrian stepped inside. He didn't say anything. He simply placed something on her nightstand, a small plate with a cup of warm milk and a cookie. Leah blinked. "What's this?" Adrian shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "You skipped dinner." Her heart skipped a beat. Was this concern? A soft smile played on her lips as she picked up the cup. "Thank you, Adrian." He didn't respond, but this time, he didn't walk away immediately either. He lingered at the doorway, his expression unreadable, before finally turning and leaving. Leah stared at the closed door, warmth blooming in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to Adrian Knight than he let the world see. And maybe she was starting to see it. The small gesture of warm milk and cookies shouldn't have meant anything. And yet it did. Leah found herself thinking about it more than she should. Why would Adrian care if she ate or not? He was cold, detached, a man who married her for convenience. And yet, in that quiet moment, he had looked after her in his own way. The following morning, Leah expected things to return to normal, Adrian ignoring her, keeping his distance. But when she walked into the dining area, he was still home. She paused at the sight of him sitting at the breakfast table, casually sipping his coffee. His usual sharp suit was replaced with a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. It was the first time she had seen him look relaxed. Adrian glanced up. "You're awake." Leah hesitated before taking a seat across from him. "You're home late today." "I have a meeting at noon," he replied simply, then gestured toward the table.
Eat.
She blinked. "Are you waiting for me?" He didn't answer, just took another sip of coffee. A small smile tugged at Leah's lips. He wouldn't admit it, but he was. She picked up her fork, feeling a strange warmth settle inside her chest. Maybe this marriage wasn't as unbearable as she thought. Later that evening, Leah found herself alone in the library, flipping through a book, when she heard the door open. Adrian walked in, his usual unreadable expression in place. "Did I interrupt?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just reading." He walked over and picked up a book from the shelf, fingers tracing the spine thoughtfully. "You like poetry?" he asked, glancing at the book in her hands. She looked down, surprised. "Yes, but I didn't think you'd care about something like that." Adrian smirked faintly. "There's a lot you don't know about me, Leah." She studied him for a moment. "Then tell me." A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He hesitated, as if debating whether to let her in. Then, in a voice quieter than usual, he said, "I used to read to my mother when she was sick." Leah's breath caught. This was the first time he had ever shared something personal. Adrian immediately looked away, as if regretting his words. But Leah didn't push. Instead, she closed her book and softly said, "She must have loved that." For a brief moment, his expression softened. And just like that, the distance between them shrank. The days following Adrian's quiet confession felt different. There was no dramatic change, no sudden warmth in his demeanor, but the air between them had shifted. Small moments stood out. The way Adrian lingered a second longer before leaving for work. The way he casually asked if she had eaten. The way he would glance at her when he thought she wasn't looking. And Leah found herself noticing him too. One evening, Adrian informed her they had to attend another corporate event together. "Why me?" she asked, arching a brow. "Wouldn't it be better to go alone if you're just going to ignore me in public anyway?" Adrian sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. "The board members expect my wife to be present." Leah rolled her eyes, but went to get ready. That night, she wore a sleek black gown that fit her perfectly. Adrian's gaze briefly darkened when she stepped out of the room, but he said nothing. As they arrived at the high-end restaurant, everything went as expected. Adrian remained the distant, composed CEO, and Leah played the part of his elegant wife. Until someone unexpected arrived. Ryan Carter, an old college friend of Leah's. "Leah?" Ryan's voice was filled with surprise as he approached their table. Leah smiled. Ryan, it's been so long. Adrian's jaw tensed. Ryan looked between them, his brows lifting in disbelief. Wait, you're married to Adrian Knight? Leah hesitated, but before she could answer, Adrian casually placed his arm around her waist. Yes, he said smoothly. Leah is my wife. Leah's heart skipped a beat. Ryan's expression faltered for a second before he forced a smile. Well, I guess congratulations are in order. The conversation continued, but Leah could feel the weight of Adrian's touch. He didn't let go, didn't loosen his hold. And when Ryan finally left, she turned to Adrian. Was that necessary? He looked at her, his voice calm but firm. I don't like the way he looked at you. Her breath caught. Because for the first time, Adrian Knight didn't sound indifferent at all. That night, as they returned home, the tension in the air remained thick. Leah kicked off her heels and turned to face him. So, are you going to tell me why you acted like a possessive husband back there? Adrian unbuttoned his collar, his gaze unreadable. You're my wife. By contract, she reminded him. A muscle in his jaw twitched. That doesn't mean I'll stand by and let another man think he has a chance with you. Leah stared at him, heart pounding. Adrian, what are we doing? Silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I don't know anymore. And for the first time since their marriage began, Leah realized she wasn't the only one struggling to keep her distance. After that night, everything changed. Adrian didn't bring up the incident with Ryan again, but his actions spoke louder than words. The way he touched the small of her back when they walked. The way his gaze lingered on her longer than before. The way he found excuses to stay home a little later in the mornings. Leah told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things. But then came the weekend getaway. Adrian's company had a weekend retreat for top executives, and spouses were invited. Leah had expected it to be another formal event where she simply played the role of the CEO's wife. She hadn't expected them to be stuck in the same suite. This was the only available room? She asked, staring at the massive king-sized bed in the center of the space. Adrian loosened his tie. Apparently, Leah exhaled. Fine. I'll take the couch. You're not sleeping on the couch. She turned to him, crossing her arms. And why not? Adrian sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Leah, just take the bed. It's big enough. I won't do anything. She hesitated before finally nodding. But sleeping beside Adrian Knight wasn't as easy as she thought. Leah lay stiffly on one side of the bed, trying to ignore the presence of the man mere inches away. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Finally, she turned slightly, only to find Adrian awake, staring at the ceiling. Can't sleep? She asked softly. A muscle in his jaw tightened. I have too much on my mind. Something about the way he said it made her heart ache. Do you want to talk about it? Silence. Then, he turned his head to look at her. You drive me insane, he admitted. Leah's breath caught. I thought this marriage would be simple, he continued, his voice low. A contract. A business deal. But it's not. Because every time I see you, I want. He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. Leah swallowed hard. You want what? His eyes darkened. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. But then, he closed his eyes and rolled onto his back, putting distance between them. Forget it, he murmured. But Leah knew. She knew. Adrian Knight was falling for her. And the scariest part? She was falling for him too. Leah had always known her marriage to Adrian was built on a fragile foundation. A contract. A deal. A lifeline. But that night in the hotel suite changed everything. She couldn't ignore the way his voice had softened. The way his usually guarded eyes had darkened with something close to longing. The way she had felt her own heart race, anticipating a kiss that never came. Back in the city, Adrian seemed more distant than ever. If before, he had shown glimpses of warmth, now he had built his walls higher than ever. Leah hated it. Hated how much she missed the way his fingers would brush against hers. The way he would silently make sure she had eaten. The way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. One evening, she found him in the study, drowning himself in work. "You're avoiding me," she said bluntly. Adrian didn't even look up. "I'm busy." Leah stepped closer. "That's not an answer." Still, he refused to acknowledge her. Frustration burned in her chest. Is this how it's going to be now? After everything? He slammed the pen down. "There is no everything, Leah." She flinched. Adrian exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, almost pained. "You weren't supposed to matter," he admitted. "But you do." Leah's heart pounded. Adrian looked at her then, his gaze unreadable. "That's why I need to stop this before it's too late." Her throat tightened. "Before what?" His jaw clenched. "Before I do something we'll both regret." But Leah wasn't sure she would regret it at all. Days passed, but the tension between them didn't fade. If anything, it grew. One evening, after another corporate event, they returned home late. Leah turned to leave for her room, but Adrian caught her wrist. She froze. Slowly, she turned back to face him, her breath hitching at the intensity in his eyes. "Leah," he murmured. Her heart pounded. And then he kissed her. It wasn't careful. It wasn't hesitant. It was raw, desperate, like he had been holding back for too long. "And Leah?" She kissed him back. Because in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't just a contract anymore. And maybe it never had been. Leah didn't know how long the kiss lasted. All she knew was that the moment Adrian's lips touched hers, everything else faded. The cold, distant CEO who had once treated her like nothing more than a contract was gone. In his place was a man whose touch was both hesitant and desperate, as if he was finally allowing himself to feel. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers, breathing heavily. "We shouldn't have done that," he murmured. Leah's heart pounded. "Then why did you?" His fingers traced her jawline, his gaze dark and unreadable. "Because you drive me insane." A part of her wanted to pull away, to remind herself that this wasn't real, that this was just a contract, a temporary arrangement. But another part of her wanted to believe otherwise. For the next few days, everything between them changed. Adrian no longer avoided her. Instead, he found excuses to be around her more. Subtle touches, stolen glances, lingering moments that shouldn't have meant anything, but did. Leah should have been happy. And yet, fear settled deep in her chest. Because she was falling for him. For the man who had once been nothing more than a contract. For the man who, in public, still pretended she meant nothing. And worst of all, she had no idea if he felt the same. One evening, as she stood by the balcony, lost in thought, she heard Adrian's voice behind her.
"Leah."
She turned, startled. The look in his eyes was different tonight. Determined, as if he had made up his mind about something. Before she could speak, he closed the distance between them, cupping her face in his hands. "I want you to be mine," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not because of this contract. Not because of anyone else." Her breath caught. "I want you," he said again, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "But only if you want me to." Leah's heart raced. There it was. The choice she had been dreading. Because this was no longer a contract. No longer a temporary arrangement. This was real. And if she said yes, there would be no turning back. Leah's heart pounded as she stared into Adrian's eyes. The cold, untouchable CEO was gone. In his place stood a man who wanted her. Not as part of a deal, not as a temporary arrangement, but as something real. And that terrified her. "Adrian," she whispered, searching for the right words. His grip on her waist tightened slightly, as if bracing himself for rejection. "If you don't feel the same, tell me now and I'll walk away. I'll end this contract." Leah's breath caught. End the contract? That was all she had wanted in the beginning. Her freedom, her independence. But now,
She didn't want him to walk away.
because somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing him as just her husband on paper. Somewhere along the way, she had fallen in love. Leah swallowed hard, then reached up, gently placing her hand over his. "Adrian, I don't want you to let me go." His entire body went still. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, as if making sure he had heard her right. And then he kissed her. This time it wasn't desperate. It wasn't rushed.
It was slow, deep.
Full of unspoken promises. The next morning, Adrian called his lawyer. "I want to void the contract," he said firmly. Leah stiffened. "Adrian." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Because I don't need a contract to keep you by my side." Her breath caught. Because this was real. She smiled softly. "Good. Because I wasn't planning on leaving." Adrian exhaled, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his face. And just like that, their marriage was no longer a contract. It was love.